Question number 1F says make R the subject of the following equation. Now the first thing I'm going to do here is what we want is here this R squared, it's currently being squared. Now I'm going to multiply both sides of this equation by R squared, and the reason I'm going to do that is to get this R squared off the bottom. I don't like it being on the bottom. If I multiply both sides by R squared, these R squareds cancel out and I'm left with F times by R squared equals K capital Q times by Q. And my aim is obviously to get this R squared by itself, so now I'm going to remove the F from this side by dividing both sides of this equation by a capital F like so, and when I do that these do cancel out and I'm left with R squared equals K times capital Q times lowercase q over F. Now I need to remove the square from this part of the equation, and so I'm going to take the square root of both sides like this, and the square root of R squared will just be R, and so I'm going to be left with R is equal to plus or minus the square root of K Q times Q over F. Now, why this plus or minus? Remember, when we take the square root of something, the answer could be positive or it could also be negative. And that's because if I'm looking for some number that's squared is equal to 4, remember that 2 squared is equal to 4, but also negative 2 squared is equal to 4. So I need to include both the positive and the negative in my answer. Question 2 is a relatively straightforward substitution question. We're not asked to transpose or anything like that. It's pretty simple. We're asked to find the value of E, and E is already on the left-hand side of the equation. So all we really need to do is to substitute these values into the equation wherever we see them listed. So these are the values we need to substitute. So I'm going to start off by rewriting the equation. E is equal to K plus mgh, and now I just substitute my values. That's equal to 250 plus 2 times by 10 times by 5, and obviously 2 times 5 is 10 times 10 is 100, so that's 250 plus 100 is equal to 350. And that's all we need to do here. It's a very straightforward question. Question 3 says to make C the subject of the equation and then find its value, given that we're given the values of the other equations or the other variables here. So I need to rearrange this equation here to make C the subject, or to have C on the left-hand side by itself. So the first thing I'm going to do is, like most people, they don't like working with fractions. Let's get rid of the fractions by multiplying both sides by 1 minus alpha. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 1 minus alpha. And this will end up with K outside of 1 minus alpha is equal to C times by alpha squared. And now if I can just divide both sides here by alpha squared, divide both sides by alpha squared, divide by alpha squared, these cancel out and I'm left with C equals, and I'll just change the side of the equation here. So I'm going to left with C equals K times by 1 minus alpha over alpha squared. Now you might be tempted to finish working on the equation at this point in time, but we're also asked to find its values. So now I need to find its values. So we know that C is equal to capital K outside of 1 minus alpha divided by alpha squared. Now we can just substitute these values, substitute this value here and this value here into the equation. So C is equal to 6.9 times by 1 minus 0.05 divided by 0.05 all squared, and given that this is most likely a calculator type question, we can plug that into our calculators and we will end up with a value of 2,622. Question number 9 is quite wordy, but if we read through it, it's reasonably easy to figure out what they're trying to ask us to do. So the volume of the cone, they've given us a formula here for the volume of a cone, and it tells us what each of the variables are. R is the radius, H is the vertical height. It then gives us some of the values. The volume is 100 centimeters cubed and the radius is root 12, and then it asks you to find the height. Now, in almost all of these questions, what you'll find is that if you count up the number of variables in the question here, you've been given all bar one of the values and you have to find the final value. So let's start by rewriting the equation. V is equal to 1/3 pi r squared h. And the next thing we need to do is to substitute the values that we know. So we know that the volume here is 100, so 100, and we know that the radius is root 12, so the radius squared will be root 12 squared, and let's just chuck in the rest of 1/3 times pi times h. And just going to tidy this up a little bit because root 12 squared will just be 12. So 100 is equal to 1/3 times by 12 times by pi times by h. And I've just rearranged these a little bit just to make it a little bit easier, because 1/3 times 12 is just simply 4. So now I'm going to have 100 equals 4 times by pi times by h. And to arrange it so that we get the h by itself, I'm just going to divide both sides by 4 pi. And that's going to leave me with h is equal to, well, 100 divided by 4 is 25, so that's going to give me 25 over pi. And let's just go back and check the question. The height here, it doesn't really tell us what the height is, but given that the radius is centimeters and the volume is centimeters cubed, then we know that the height will be 25 over pi centimeters. And that is the answer to this question. Just a final note on transposition and substitution. We can use our CAS calculator to transpose equations for us, and it works very, very well and very easily. Remember, previously we've looked at the solve function here, and the solve function does the transposition for us as well. And if you remember, to get solve, we'll just press menu, then 3 for algebra and 1 for solve, and we just need to type in the equation. So here we have t equals 2 pi times the square root of m over k, and we want to make k the subject here, so we want to make k the subject. And so we type in solve t equals 2 times pi times the square root of m over k. Then we put a little comma and the k, and the calculator will rearrange it for us all like this and also give us the constraints. Don't worry too much about the constraints at this stage. We'll be talking about those later on in the course.